Hey, you're listening to the On the Media Midweek Podcast. I'm Micah Loewinger. This week, the Idaho Senate is considering a bill that would block transgender people from using public bathrooms that conform with their gender identity. A first offense could land someone in prison for a year. This bill is the latest in a cascade of legal actions stripping away trans rights. In Kansas,
around 1,700 people in Kansas are about to have their driver's licenses declared invalid. Why? Because they're transgender.
A new Kansas law takes effect requiring transgender people to use public building bathrooms corresponding with their sex at birth.
It lets any citizens sue someone they think is trans for $1,000 if they violate that rule.
In Tennessee,
House Bill 754 would require clinics who perform gender transition surgeries to also perform detransition procedures. It would also require clinics and insurance companies to report the occurrence of these procedures to the Tennessee Department of Health, who would then record various statistics into a database.
And in West Virginia,
the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has reversed a lower court ruling, meaning that the state's Medicaid policy excluding coverage for gender-affirming surgeries will be upheld.
That last ruling was based on a Supreme Court decision from June in a case called U.S. versus Skirmety. The High Court upheld a Tennessee law banning puberty blockers and gender-affirming care for minors. In order to better understand these legal setbacks, civil rights attorney Alejandra Caraballo has looked to legal scholar Ernst Frankel.
He created what was called the dual state.
Brooke spoke to Alejandra earlier this month.
And he divided it into two categories, the normative state and the prerogative state. The normative state is basically everything that you run into every day. You go and pay your taxes, you go to court. The state is pretty much acting as normal. And then there's the prerogative state, which acts with an arbitrary violence against a targeted minority group. That group cannot expect any sort of fair or consistent treatment by the state.
My understanding is that Frankel saw this play out. He was a lawyer, Jewish lawyer, in housing.
Yeah, Jews were being stripped of their homes, property rights, legal rights to own businesses. Nothing in the Weimar Constitution, which was still operative, allowed for that, but none of that mattered because they were part of the prerogative state. You do have a 6-year period before you get to the camps and whatnot. This period where Jews are increasingly being targeted, and also not just them, gays, lesbians, trans people in Nazi Germany were also targeted. And so you have this useful framework for how authoritarian states target particular minority communities and how the legal systems contort themselves to enable that persecution of that minority group. I don't necessarily mean to compare directly to the Holocaust.
It's always dangerous.
Yes. The reason why that resonates is that that's essentially what we're starting to see here in the United States with the ways that courts and the legal system are starting to abrogate the rights of trans people.
Yeah, they can't go to the courts because the laws have changed. They live in what seems to be a fetal or maybe adolescent prerogative state.
Essentially, yeah.
You say there's a kind of dual state approach when it comes to medical care, the way the HHS treats trans people's health care versus other kinds of health care.
Exactly. They're deregulating how drugs are approved. These kinds of supplements are being sold. RFK Jr. hawking all kinds of snake oil all the time. Meanwhile, they are cracking down on gender-affirming care for trans youth and launching investigations against providers of gender-affirming care. They claim on one hand, especially with the right around vaccines, we want to ensure that parents have the rights to choose medical treatments for their children, and they do that in the instance of vaccines. But when it comes to gender-affirming care, they say, well, parents don't have that right anymore.
Parents have the right to withhold the care. They just don't have the right to provide the care.
Yeah.
In the Skirmety case, when presented with a petition about parental rights to choose youth trans medical care, the Supreme Court didn't weigh in, but in an earlier decision, it did to deny it.
They punted. They didn't even bring up the parental rights question in Scrimeti about whether or not parents have the right to choose the medical treatment for their child and not be barred by the state from seeking it. And ultimately, the Supreme Court punted on that. But then there was a case out of California where the schools banned forced outing so that school officials could not forcefully out a trans youth to their parents, which could potentially result in harm to that youth from being kicked out, being disowned. In an emergency shadow docket posture, they re-enabled an injunction against that law because they believed that it was against the parental rights of those parents, of those students. And so you have the Supreme Court going above and beyond to protect the rights of one set of parents and then completely ignoring the rights of another set of parents when presented with that question in a formal cert petition.
Let's go to Kansas, shall we? Governor Laura Kelly vetoed the bathroom bounty bill, which contained two provisions: the immediate invalidation of the driver's licenses of trans people if their gender marker doesn't match their gender assigned at birth. The second provision, the so-called bathroom bounty, allows anyone to sue anybody they suspect of being transgender if they walk into the wrong, quote-unquote, restroom in a government facility. Now, the governor vetoed it, calling it poorly drafted with overreaching consequences that would cost millions of taxpayer dollars to comply with when that money is already really tight in Kansas. And then the state legislature overturned her veto. 2 trans residents in Kansas are suing. Now, this strikes me as textbook dual state stuff. They seem to be persecuted for simply existing.
Exactly. They went without any sort of committee hearings. They did what was called a cut and go, where they essentially took another bill, completely cut out the text, put in this new bill that had the bathroom bounty bill and the revocation of licenses and birth certificates. The Kansas legislature rushed this through, and in less than 3 weeks, it went from basically no one knowing that this bill existed to being enacted and people were losing their driver's licenses. I mean, that's how quickly it went.
Let's explain why these two things are a big deal, driver's licenses and bathrooms. Why we could go slowly padding up to the dual state structure of the Nazis with these relatively minor things like driver's licenses and bathrooms.
If you can't use the bathroom, you can't participate in society. And a lot of people will just say, well, you could just use the bathroom of your sex assigned at birth. Well, if you're a trans person, you often don't look anything like your sex assigned at birth anymore. For trans women, if you go and use the men's restroom, that puts you at extreme risk of sexual assault, harassment, even violent assault. And this is not a theoretical, this has happened. Trans men are really in a bind because oftentimes they have deep voices, beards, they look just like any other man, and they're being told they have to use the women's bathroom. So what's going to happen if somebody who comes in with a very deep voice, burly with a beard, walks into the women's restroom? Everyone is going to freak out about it. That's exactly what this law requires. Ultimately, what that means for trans people is they can't participate in society because you can only hold going to the bathroom for so long. If you're at work for 8 hours or 10 hours a day, you'll start getting bladder infections. And then there's the driver's license aspect.
Right. The driver's licenses of trans people in Kansas, there was no warning. They were suddenly invalid. That was it. They couldn't drive.
They could risk arrest for driving with a suspended license to just go to the DMV and get a new license. That puts people at immense risk. They have to ask friends or family to be able to drive them. They have to miss work. It's incredibly disruptive. Some people say, well, you just have your driver's license that says your sex assigned at birth. And for trans people, that's oftentimes incredibly dangerous. Just even buying a 6-pack of beer, the way you look is not going to match the sex listed on the driver's license, which could out you, subject you to harassment and violence.
You might say, well, why don't you just go and get your driver's license in a state other than Kansas? But even that's not so easy.
Yeah. So let's just say you were like, I'm done with this. I'm leaving Kansas. The state is hostile to trans people. If you were to move to New York or California and try to activate a license in those states, you would not be able to until you lifted the suspension on your Kansas license. So you can't even leave the state without the indignity of going to the DMV, getting a new license issued with a gender marker that does not align with your gender identity.
Last December, the Texas newsroom obtained internal documents through records requests that showed that the Texas Department of Public Safety had compiled a list of 110 trans people who tried to update their license information between August 2024 and August 2025. So when pressed, the Department of Public Safety in Texas didn't say why, and Texas isn't alone here. Indiana, you've said, may also be compiling a similar list. So connect this to the dual state framework. I mean, governments compiling lists of minority groups is never a great sign.
Yeah. We don't know why they're compiling these lists. Kansas ultimately had a list of trans people that had changed their gender markers, and immediately they were able to suspend their licenses. Texas, Indiana, or these other states, if they're able to compile them, they could do similar things. We've heard the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, saying that trans people should not be teachers in public schools in Texas. They could create a list of people who are not eligible for teaching licenses within the state of Texas if they're transgender. Any number of permutations that they could use these kinds of lists to target trans people and ensure that they cannot have any sort of meaningful contribution to society. They can't work, they can't get driver's licenses, they can't get identification documents, and ultimately with this push around voter IDs, even be able to vote. Pretty much every aspect of this is trying to strip any semblance of normality from a trans person's life.
I think there was one instance where someone who never changed their gender marker but changed their name still had their license invalidated.
Yeah, that happened in Kansas as part of this, and they were unsure as to exactly how that happened. Kansas said that it was an error, but something still triggered them being added to that list. That's intensely scary. Idaho right now, they just passed through the House and it's going through their state Senate, a bill that would enact a 5-year felony charge for using the bathroom that aligns with your gender identity. I mean, this is where we're at now.
You've noted that unless these lists are used in a discriminatory manner, they're illegal. If they say, hey, we have this list of people we identified as trans and now they're barred from being teachers, that's unconstitutional, no matter what the governor of Texas says. Your worry with regard to the law is that the Supreme Court is hinting that they don't view trans status as something that is immutable, something that just can't be changed with the wind.
You could see this in Justice Barrett's questioning and her concurrence in Scarametti, and they view being trans essentially as a choice and something that can just be easily changed. And so as a result of that, they don't believe that it meets the requirements for protected class status. I do believe being trans is immutable. Like, it's not subject to external change. But even if it wasn't, we do protect other classes that don't have immutable status, and that includes religion. You can change your religion, and that is still protected under the Constitution. So that's kind of a frustrating double standard. But regardless, that is worrying, because if they don't believe that it's something that is immutable and can be changed, they can then endorse methods to try and force that change. And we're seeing that with the potential decision in Childs v. Salazar, which may invalidate bans on conversion therapy in over 21 states.
Let's hop back quickly to medical care. In Tennessee, the Attorney General was able to access and identify incredibly intimate medical records of trans people held by Vanderbilt Medical Center. That included therapy notes, photos, pre-op and post-op. No one knows why.
Yeah. So the Tennessee Attorney General used the pretext of investigation for fraud against Vanderbilt University and issued subpoenas asking them for all of their medical records related to gender-affirming care, not just for trans youth, but for all their transgender patients.
That is a very familiar Trump administration pretext to intrude into places.
This is exactly where the Trump administration got its playbook from. Tennessee, Missouri, and Texas had been doing this for years, where they were attempting to get at the medical records of trans people. Tennessee was the most successful, and Vanderbilt did not even fight those subpoenas. There was a lawsuit filed arguing that they violated the patient privacy rights of their patients, and that's still pending.
The Ninth Court of Appeals heard a case involving QueerDoc, a telehealth gender-affirming care practice that the DOJ subpoenaed in July. It was seeking more than a dozen types of records dating back to 2020, demanding names, birth dates, addresses, social security numbers of patients. DOJ said it needed this data to investigate whether QueerDoc was engaging in fraudulent insurance billing. What's going on there?
This is part of the intimidation tactic by the Justice Department to try and force providers to stop providing gender-affirming care, particularly to trans youth. The Justice Department sent out roughly over 20 different subpoenas to 20 different medical providers, to some of the top children's hospitals around the country, alleging that they were engaged in fraudulent billing practices with insurance. They're claiming that using alternative billing codes in billing practice, which is utilized widely, but using any other sort of billing code other than ones that are directly tied to gender dysphoria is somehow fraudulent. So for instance, when they're prescribing hormones, they'll say endocrine disorder unspecified. And that just may be how the insurance companies prefer that to be billed. A single provider can have to bill potentially 20 different insurance companies at any given time, Medicaid, Medicare, and each one of those may have a different practice for how they accept the billing code. And so what they're saying is that you use something like endocrine disorder unspecified rather than treatment for gender dysphoria, it's fraudulent. There's not intent to deceive or defraud insurance companies here, but they're using that mismatch and abusing it, again, tying to the framework of the dual state. That's just everyday billing practices. But when it comes to trans people, suddenly that becomes fraud. And as a result of that, they are using that pretext to issue these subpoenas and claim broad authority to access not only medical records, but internal employee communications, external emails, all kinds of things. That is just basically a giant fishing expedition. QueerDoc fought the subpoena and they won. And the Trump administration is essentially appealing that. They want the threat of the subpoenas to get people to stop provision of care voluntarily. And that's what we've seen with so many different providers who have voluntarily withdrawn providing this care just out of pre-compliance and fear.
And this also connects back to the dual state in terms of isolating these disfavored members of society. Trans people would be less likely to seek medical care or be honest or truthful with their own providers.
Exactly. If you're a trans person and you're worried that your provider will be subpoenaed by the federal government and all your medical records will be handed over to some DOJ flack, you're going to be less willing to be upfront with your medical providers. If you have to go to the hospital, you may not disclose that you're transgender because you're concerned that that may be used against you.
In a piece for The Dissident last September, you wrote that these structural attacks against trans people are the prerogative state in action. You called it a raw and undisguised exercise of power to eliminate a disfavored minority from the public sphere. Eliminate?
This is straight up from Speaker Michael Knowles, who was at CPAC now 3 years ago.
That's the conservative gathering that happens every year that sort of sets the template for where the far right will move.
Exactly. And he said to a giant audience, we must eradicate transgenderism from society. He's repeated that multiple times. Chris Rufo has recently retweeted that exact statement.
Another sort of philosopher activist of the far right.
Exactly. They use this disingenuous trolling where they say, well, we aren't saying we want to eradicate trans people. We just want to eradicate transgenderism. And I don't know how you do one without doing the other, because you can't coerce people into not being trans, and you can't kill ideologies. You can't kill ideas. Ideas exist outside of people. The only thing you can do is kill people. Yeah, there's an old study that said that about 41% of trans people attempt suicide at some point in their life, which is a pretty stark number and is orders of magnitude higher than the rest of the population. And there's people online that go around making memes about it, saying we've got to raise that 41% to 100%.
How common is this just a couple of cranks?
I mean, it's pretty widespread on Twitter. There was a young girl, a trans girl who's 17, who took a picture of a bridge and said, it's so pretty from up here. And the next day it was found that she had taken her own life and jumped from the bridge. That image that she posted on Twitter went viral, over 100 million views. The vast majority of the replies were celebrating it, celebrating that she took her own life and making jokes about it. Now, the picture that she took, trolls are taking that and putting it in the replies of trans people and making a meme out of that picture. It's very clear they want to drive the factors that cause trans people to be suicidal. They don't have to do it themselves. They could just make everything so bad that they hope that trans people do it themselves.
So what do we learn from other historical moments when the dual state framework has come into play? If you go back to the civil rights movement, you'll see white people at the time, some of them saying, these Black activists are too aggressive, they're kind of scary, they need to play by the rules, stop agitating so hard, stop offending people.
I mean, civil rights movements are almost never popular in the moments when they are able to succeed and push through. But what's unique about trans people is that we're actually on the other side of this. A lot of the things that are happening to us were policy wins that we already won years or decades ago. The ability to change our gender markers, that was through quiet advocacy for over years. In many states, you've been able to do that for decades. You're able to change the gender marker on your passport since 1992. So that's 33 years that you were able to do that. And then that got taken away. Iowa became the first state ever to remove duly enacted civil rights protections for a group based on any protected class. And just yesterday, they enacted another bill that prevents cities from even enacting their own protections for trans people. So this is far beyond just backlash. This is now a regression, wiping out decades of what trans advocacy has been able to accomplish.
Wow.
I struggle to find parallels. I mean, there was obviously backlash to the civil rights movement and the feminist wave of the 70s.
This is kind of more like what happened after Reconstruction.
Reconstruction is probably the closest I can think of where a group who had previously been able to secure substantial civil rights protections is systematically having them erased. That's the closest parallel, because even the backlash of the 80s to the civil rights movements, none of them were able to strip the kinds of rights that they are doing now.
Elon Musk and other groups on the far right are pushing an idea that empathy is weakness. They call it suicidal empathy.
Yeah.
How does that relate to this?
What they really mean by that is if you're concerned about immigrants, if you're concerned about trans people, if you're concerned about Muslims, you are contributing to the downfall of Western civilization. And if anything, it's the opposite. It's the lack of empathy. It's the lack of compassion for our fellow humans that is causing so much of the problems in our world.
Alejandra, thank you very much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Alejandra Caraballo is a civil rights attorney and a clinical instructor at Harvard Law Cyber Law Clinic.
That's it for the Midweek Podcast. Don't forget to catch the big show on Friday. And while I have you, if you haven't already, go ahead and follow us on Instagram and TikTok. We also have a OTM subreddit where you can see some of the videos we've been making recently, Brooke and I talking about some of our favorite moments from the show. We'd love to hear what you think. I'm Michael Loeninger.